queria primeiramente agradecer aí a organização do IBRAC, especialmente o Ricardo, pelos painéis e pelo convite aqui também para moderar. Acho que, em primeiro lugar, acho que tem uma importância de falarmos de por que esse painel foi escolhido, né? Acho que todos sabem da relevância que o DMA, né, do Digital Market Act, tem tornado ali nas discussões, principalmente na Europa, mas também que tipo de inter-relações isso tem trazido aqui para o Brasil. Então, acho que a ideia da gente reunir aqui um excelente quórum aqui de painelistas é para que a gente traga as diferentes vertentes, né, de que como cada um, tanto a Comissão Europeia, quanto alguém também aqui de uma empresa como o Google, o Ioannis, que eu já vou comentar, que infelizmente ele não pôde estar presente, ele queria muito, mas infelizmente ele teve um compromisso pessoal, então ele não pôde se juntar a nós aqui no Brasil, mas ele está aqui conosco virtualmente, né, um acadêmico também super renomado, que vai trazer para nós aí as discussões de casos e acadêmicos do tema do DMA. Então, assim, para contextualizar um pouco o nosso painel de hoje, a ideia é falar de que a gente sabe que tem aumentado, né, a regulação dos mercados digitais, né, e acho que o DMA ele vem muito na linha, principalmente na Europa, na linha disso, né, de como que a gente tem essas implicações no antitruste, nas práticas dos negócios, das empresas, na dinâmica do mercado, tanto na Europa quanto de forma global, né? Então, acho que o painel de hoje ele tem essa importância de discutir de que forma o DMA tem sido aplicado na prática. Acho que nessa linha, o Lluís Saurí, ele vai até falar um pouco para nós de como é que a Europa, né, tem tratado esse tema do ponto de vista mais prático. O Michael também trará um pouco a visão por parte ali de uma empresa privada, e quais são as atualizações, né, e os principais casos que o Ioannis vai trazer para a gente aqui, inclusive, para a gente conhecer, né, o que a gente, quando a gente fala de DMA, como é que isso na prática ela está sendo tratada em diferentes abordagens, né. Então, acho que a ideia de hoje é que a gente fale sobre esses tópicos. A gente, de novo, tem aqui os representantes bastante importantes para seguir. A dinâmica do painel vai ser, cada um vai trazer um pouco as suas principais visões de início. Depois a gente segue por perguntas entre os painelistas e, no finalzinho, a gente deixa aberto para perguntas da plateia. Então, eu vou antes... o painel tem duração, né, de 1h25, então a gente até tem meio-dia 15, é isso. Então, tem uma missão aqui da gente não se estender muito por conta do almoço. E eu, antes de passar a palavra aqui para cada um deles, eu vou fazer uma apresentação dos nossos painelistas. Primeiro, a gente tem aqui o Diogo Thomson, ele é doutor em Direito pelo Instituto Brasiliense de Ensino, Desenvolvimento e Pesquisa, o IDP, mestre em Filosofia do Direito pela PUC, foi superintendente adjunto do Cade e superintendente geral interino, foi diretor do Departamento de Proteção de Defesa Econômica da Secretaria do Direito Econômico, né, da STE, atuou como procurador junto ao Cade, desde 2004 ele também é procurador federal da AGU. Temos também aqui do meu lado, né, o online, a gente tem o professor Ioannis. O professor Ioannis, ele é diretor do Centro de Direito Comercial da Queen's Mary, da Universidade de Londres. Ele também tem bacharelado em Defesa da Concorrência e Economia. Ele também é membro da UK Competition Appeal Tribunal. Ele também é reconhecido internacionalmente para suas pesquisas e expertise em competition, law, digital markets e comparative policy. Ele é especialmente focado em discussões da Comissão Europeia, dos Estados Unidos, BRICS e outros temas. Ele tem uma extensiva conhecimento acadêmico, em especial, já tendo trabalhado no departamento britânico da OFT, na Comissão Europeia e também na FT. na Federal Trade Commission. Então, ele tem aí também uma ótima expertise para a gente tratar aqui das nossas discussões. O Lluís Saurí, ele também é Deputy Chief Competition Economist e Deputy Director da European Commission. De agosto de 23 até dezembro de 24, ele atuou como economista-chefe também na Comissão Europeia. E ele tem sido responsável, ele é o nosso economista aqui da nossa turma, e ele tem atuado como um principais responsáveis pelas análises econômicas da DJ Competition em diversas áreas de policy, antitrust, fusões, condutas e também pelo GMA. Então, ele tem mais de 15 anos aí de experiência, tanto na iniciativa privada quanto pública, nesses temas de organização política industrial e também no tema de antitrust. E, por fim, aqui temos o Michael Lawrence. Ele é Counselor and Litigator com mais de 30 anos de experiência em Competition Law, tanto in-house e também em empresas de tecnologia. Ele tem servido como Senior Competition Counsel da Google. Ele se juntou ao Google em 2011 e ele fica na Califórnia, né? Então, acho que ele tem aí uma larga experiência. Antes do Google, ele também trabalhou na Intel Corporation por 6 anos, também com temas relacionados à competition. Michael também foi associado do Latton e Watkins em Los Angeles, e ele tem aí uma extensa experiência. Bom, sem querer me prolongar muito aqui sobre a exposição dos nossos painelistas, a gente vai ter, algumas pessoas vão falar em inglês, outras vão falar em português, então acho que aqui a ideia é que a gente inicie no tema aqui da exposição do GMA. I'm going to switch to English, and then I'm going to talk to Lluís Saurí. Saurí is going to give an overview of what the European Commission has been doing lately about GMA, including the general approach in recent decision and compliance. So, please.
Thank you very much. Eu vou falar um pouquinho de português, um pouquinho de inglês. Assim, pelo menos na apresentação. Obrigado para o IBRAC pelo convite. Obrigado também em particular a Fabiana e Ricardo por ter me convidado. Um prazer estar aqui. Eu falei que vou falar um pouquinho em português, um pouquinho em inglês, porque não tenho a coragem de fazer a apresentação inteira em português. Eu gostaria de poder fazer, mas desculpas, não vou conseguir. Mesmo assim, respondendo um pouco à petição da Fabiana, o que eu vou fazer é uma introdução para entre vocês, os que não estão muito familiarizados com a Digital Markets Act da Comissão da União Europeia. Eu vou explicar um pouquinho a base, a arquitetura básica da DMA. Vou tentar ser breve. Depois vou passar para uma descrição do que a gente já fez. Do que a gente já fez desde a entrada em vigor da DMA. Já faz 2 anos e meio. Tem alguns passos, algumas decisões que a Comissão Europeia já tomou. E isso é um pouquinho que vou explicar. Eu espero que também, nessa descrição, vão sair alguns dos conceitos, algumas das noções importantes, desde o ponto de vista econômico e jurídico, que depois vão ser também objeto de discussão no painel. Então, vamos lá. I will now switch to English, and I would just want to clarify that any opinions and any views are just my personal opinions and views. Sure. And they do not reflect necessarily the official position of the European Commission on any of the institutions. I'm currently visiting the FGV, so it's also not representing the views of the FGV on the matters. So as I said, I will start with a little bit what is the architecture of the Digital Markets Act, giving a little bit of context. What context? I mean, if we look, let's zoom out a little bit from digital markets, and if we think of what is the evidence of what has been going on in markets over the last decades. One of the empirical evidences that we have is that industry concentration seems to have risen, markups seems to have risen as well, market power seems to be also growing, And this seems to have been happening across the economy with variations from one sector to another. But one of the sectors where we see that very, very intensely is the digital sector. And this is partly related probably to some technological progress, globalization. There are many factors that may explain that. And many of those factors have been also the source of efficiencies and growth and welfare. And technological progress, digitalization certainly is one of those. But at the same time, it has changed the way certain markets work. And in particular, digital markets, what we start to see, what we see since a while, is this type of winner-takes-most dynamics. This tendency for incumbents in digital markets to be able to grab increasing shares of the market, market shares of the market, and to exercise market power. This has been at the basis of the antitrust enforcement on digital markets over the last 2 decades, over the last decade, where the European Commission has been quite active, and also in realizing about some of the limitations in terms of effectiveness of the antitrust enforcement in digital markets, to the realization that it was needed to incorporate new tools, new policy tools to address these challenges. And the Digital Markets Act tries to give an answer to that. Then, of course, there will be a variety of opinions whether it does a good job at doing that or not, and that's fair. But I think one of the important things, and I think there the European Commission has had a pioneer role, is in trying to address some of these issues through antitrust enforcement, realizing and making evident that there were certain things that couldn't be addressed, and therefore establishing and trying to give a first answer from a regulatory perspective to the challenges identified. And this is what the DMA tries to do. The DMA tries to do it focusing maybe on 3 things that I would say. First, the ex-ante approach, the regulatory approach. The idea that a case-by-case, in-depth analysis of every single conduct in every single situation takes so much time in a market that evolves so fast that by the time we take a decision, it's gone. And therefore, we needed to be able to act quicker, ex ante, effectively. And the second thing has been to focus on 2 aspects that are related to this way the digital markets function, related to scale economies, related to network economies, to data feedbacks. And it is the fact that some of these characteristics lead to high barriers to entry and to lack of contestability, so incumbent positions that are very much entrenched. And on the other side as well, the ability, because of this entrenched market power, of imposing unfair trading conditions to others, especially to business users. And this is why the DMA focuses on 2 concrete aspects, which is contestability and fairness. Because we are interested in the relation that these 2 characteristics then have on competition, effective competition in the market, as a source of incentives to innovate. Sometimes there is this feeling that, oh, the DMA tries to protect consumers, but then on the other side there is innovation and we are giving up on innovation. I think that's just not the right approach. What the DMA is trying to do is, by reinforcing contestability and fairness, ensure effective competition as a source of innovative incentives. And then there may be trade-offs that arise when applying that approach, and this is the interesting part of it, how exactly to deal with these trade-offs in implementation. The Digital Markets Act was proposed already back in 2020. It entered into force in November 2022, and the obligations on the platforms that have been considered to be gatekeepers, I will get to that in a minute, entered into force in 2024. So everything is quite recent. The architecture, I was saying, basically boils down to 3 main concepts. The concept of core platform service. And the concept of core platform service basically is identifying certain digital services where we observe high concentration. We observe that there is one or few players setting commercial conditions, few large players acting as gateways, so business users need to go through certain of these platforms many times or most of the time in order to be able to do certain things that are important for their business activities. And this has meant that the Digital Markets Act has included as core platform services things like online intermediation services, online search engines, operating systems, instant messaging platforms, a variety of different digital services. The second concept is the concept of gatekeeper. Different from antitrust, the DMA obligations do not apply to all companies that are active in the digital market, but only to those that are in a position that would allow them to enter into conducts that could undermine contestability or fairness. And this is what we call the gatekeepers, platforms that act as gatekeepers. They keep the gate for those business users that need the digital services to perform their business activities. This is done by looking at a number of criteria, market capitalization, number of users, the time market capitalization turnover or number of users has been above certain thresholds. And this has allowed us to identify certain gatekeepers. I will get into which ones we have designated. I'm sorry because there is a typo in the slide. The third block should be about the obligations. So the Digital Markets Act establishes a list of do's and don'ts, obligations, trying to, for example, foster contestability, foster opportunities for entry through imposing interoperability, imposing multi-homing options, or also obligations to refrain from certain conducts that can be considered unfair, be it self-preferencing, be it using private business data of business users for certain cross activities across the services, different services of the platforms. I will not enter into the exact list, but basically the idea is to establish a number of obligations and prohibitions ex ante that are relatively clear. Of course, nothing is clear, but relatively clear in terms of then companies knowing what they can do and what they cannot do, knowing what they should, how they should behave in order to comply. The relation between antitrust and Digital Markets Act is a relation of complementarity. The Digital Markets Act is not there to replace antitrust. And there are antitrust digital cases going on, investigations going on, and decisions that are being taken by the Commission in parallel to the implementation of the Digital Markets Act. Of course, to the extent that the Digital Markets Act ex ante solves certain problems and prevents certain conducts, we should see that certain cases on the antitrust side will no longer exist because the compliance through the DMA will already prevent certain problems to arise. But the DMA does not apply to everything and does not apply to everyone. So basically, that's the reason why there is still a space for antitrust enforcement, and that's also not something specific to the digital sector. Many, if you think of telecoms or if you think of other sectors where telecom regulation lives together with antitrust enforcement. That's a little bit the architecture that I wanted to explain. So you have a little bit, for those that were less familiar, you know a little bit what we are talking about or what is that we are doing. And now it's more about what we have done that I wanted also to briefly explain. I was saying, okay, not all companies have to comply with the obligations, only those that are designated by the Commission as gatekeepers on the basis of some quantitative criteria. It can also be qualitative criteria in certain cases. As a result of this exercise of designating gatekeepers, 7 corporations have been designated as gatekeepers, platforms that are in this position: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Booking, ByteDance or TikTok, Meta, and Microsoft. And for each of these gatekeepers, there are several core platform services that have been considered to require compliance with the obligations in the DMA. So here you see for each of the type of core platform service, the different colors that correspond to the different designated gatekeeper corporations. And just to say that most of them were designated on the basis of quantitative criteria, except from iPad OS, core platform service of Apple, that was designated on the basis of qualitative criteria. There was a designation that then was undesignated due to a decrease in the number of business users, and therefore no longer being above the threshold for quantitative designation. And there was also, of course, a dialogue with some of these corporations in terms of rebuttal investigations, so situations in which the Commission preliminarily found that a certain core platform service could be a gatekeeper, could deserve a gatekeeper designation, but then after a dialogue with the corporation, that was not the case. Or the other way around, we can also have third parties coming. That's, for example, the case of Opera for Edge, and that Opera was claiming that Edge should be considered a core platform service deserving gatekeeper designation. So that's a little bit, this is the universe of services that need to comply with the DMA obligations. In 2.5 years that we have been implementing, we have used, and I already said, regulatory dialogue. I think regulatory dialogue is at the basis of the approach of the DMA. This does not mean that things are decided by consensus. In the end, it's the Commission that decides, right? And then the courts that will review the decisions of the Commission. But the decisions of the Commission are not arbitrarily taken, of course. They are the result of evidence and dialogue, as in any regulatory setting. In particular, there are two types of proceedings that we have been focusing on in the last year, if you want. On the one hand, specification proceedings, and on the other hand, non-compliance proceedings, and these are different. Some of the obligations are relatively clear-cut. Some of the obligations, arguably, may have some ambiguity in terms of their application to specific settings. That's what specification proceedings are there to solve. When we observe that, especially the obligations in Article 6 of the DMA, may require some further explanation about what do they mean in practice, we launch a specification proceeding where, together with the interested party, we can debate and we can agree on what does it mean, that particular obligation for that particular core platform service. And then there are the non-compliance proceedings. For all the others that do not require a specification proceeding, what we do is we check the compliance. And this compliance needs to be shown by the gatekeeper. So it's on the gatekeeper the burden of showing compliance, and through taking the explanation of the measures that have been actively taken and implemented in order to ensure the compliance, through the reports that they submit to the Commission, and also through the public, like the non-confidential versions of reports that will be publicly shared, so that also third parties active in the market can also monitor and help the Commission monitor compliance. I think the role of third parties, the role of business users and competitors is very important for the success, or at least that's the feeling of the Commission. It's very important for the success of this regulation. How many formal proceedings to date have been opened? I think here are the three gatekeepers for which we have been opening formal proceedings. As I was explaining before, there are the specification proceedings on one side, and the non-compliance procedures on the others. Most of them have been non-compliance procedures relating basically to questions of steering in the apps, choice screens, interoperability questions, self-preferencing, things that remind us a little bit of the experience that we have from our antitrust cases. So also to say that all that we do in the DMA also is based not just on good economics and good law, but also on all the experience accumulated from the last years of antitrust experience. So they are complementary also in that sense. Just to say, I will not enter into explaining each of the proceedings because I think that would take too much time. It would take, but you can find all these in it's public information. You have the press releases of the Commission if you are interested. And just to say that in terms of specification decisions, back in April, the Commission took a couple of decisions specifying, in particular for Apple, what it meant to enable interoperability for connected devices, what it meant to ensure that the process to get access to interoperability by third parties was a process that was quick, fair, and transparent. In terms of the non-compliance decisions, there were 2 non-compliance decisions. Non-compliance decisions, the difference with specification decisions is that because it's a non-compliance decision and there has been a relatively long amount of time and dialogue to find ways of complying, they come with a fine. And they come also with a cease and desist request. In this case, we have the non-compliance decisions on Apple and on Meta for the pay and consent model. These have been appealed, so there will be a judicial review of the Commission decisions in terms of the non-compliance decisions, as it should be, of course. Then I think we have another type of decision, which is the decision on the Apple choice screens, where basically starting from a non-compliant decisions, we have decided to close the investigation because the proposals that Apple put forward in order to solve the concerns of the Commission were solved by an improvement on the choice screens that were made available to users. So that's also, let's say, a procedural option, of course, that exists. There are preliminary findings out there on ongoing investigations. I will not comment on them, but just for you to know that there are another 3 ongoing investigations. I will conclude just by saying that while the European Commission is the main implementer of the Digital Markets Act, this is not done alone. This is done in cooperation, in close cooperation. First of all, with the national competition authorities of the 27 member states of the European Union, both in terms of guaranteeing that the antitrust proceedings and the DMA proceedings do not lead to duplication. That's something that clearly needs to be avoided. It's not about adding red tape. It's not about adding unnecessary regulatory hurdle. That whenever there is a conduct by a gatekeeper that relates to a core platform service and falls under the DMA, normally the priority should be given to the DMA over antitrust enforcement, but that there may be questions about it in the specific cases, and this is solved through discussion between the national competition authorities and the European Commission, and that the national competition authorities can also be enabled by national legislation to themselves apply some of the provisions of the DMA. And finally, also to say that we are not just looking inwards, we are also looking outwards, what's happening in the world. And in the world, I think what we are seeing is an increasing consensus that some form of regulation oriented to maintain competition effectively in digital markets is necessary. And I think we have already seen the UK adopting this type of regulation. We've seen the Japan Fair Trade Commission also being responsible for this type of regulation. We have just signed a cooperation agreement with the Japan Federal Trade Commission. I think that's very important because most of these services, most of these markets work beyond borders, and therefore, to some extent, at some point, we will need to sit down and understand how do we harmonize all these regulations. I understand there is in Brazil also an ongoing discussion about what should be done in terms of regulation in Brazil. I think it's a trend that probably we are very interested to follow and to participate. That's why also I'm here. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lluís, for this great overview. So now we are going to switch to Ioannis Kokkoris. Professor is going to talk about the reflection of different perspectives regarding the implementation of DMA so far and its broader implications. So, please.
Okay, perfect. So I was saying thank you very much for the invitation to Ricardo and Fabiana. Thanks for... I'm sorry I cannot be there. It's due to a family reason that I cannot be there. These are personal views, do not reflect the views of the Competition Appeals Tribunal. I need to start with this caveat. And I will follow on from Lluís. I want to discuss some of the cases and discuss some reflections I have on the DMA, both on the text of the DMA and how it is enforced so far, and also what I see as the future trend when it comes to DMA. So I will try to share a few slides. If I fail, I'll send them ex post and they can be distributed. So bear with me to share the slides. I hope you can see my slideshow. Is it visible? Or not yet?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, perfect. So let me go into full screen. So this is what briefly I want to touch on, and I will skip some of this content because Lluís has spoken about it, but I want to focus on some of the cases, and I want to, in a way, go a step back behind DMA. When I was reading DMA and I was reading the draft DMA, I think it's obvious that it's a very technical language, and it is a very prescriptive language in many of the paragraphs. So to me, it feels, and of course I don't expect Lluís or anybody else to confirm or deny that, it feels the Commission had already received complaints about potential conducts of large big tech companies. I cannot call them gatekeepers at that point in time. And the Commission needed to try to introduce the regulation that was going to address such conduct. So some of the conduct we have on the text resemble ongoing investigations under 102 at that time. So it may have given rise to some of the wording we see there. Some of the language is very technical. I think some of the language can only be understood by an IT expert, unless somebody spends a lot of time trying to get into the detail of how these services are actually operating in practice. Lluís spoke about the obligation of gatekeepers to actually follow now what DMA says, and the Commission has been very clever on the enforcement of DMA because, as Lluís said, this is an example regulation, which means Commission avoids the very lengthy, evidence-heavy, apologies to the lawyers and the economists in the room, lawyer-economist annoying memos of many, many hundreds of pages reaching the Commission officials saying you're all wrong about this antitrust investigation and the world is different. And they wanted to actually make sure that when they enforce the rules, they also make it in a timely fashion, so any change they make is can still have effect. I think the example of how not to do it is the Microsoft case, which goes back now to 2004, Internet Explorer, which was on the choice screen of the Internet Explorer. By the time of the full implementation of that remedy, the Explorer market share had significantly diminished, arguably because of market trend, not because there was something different happening at that time. So Explorer already had a declining market share because there were new search engines out there and explorers out there in the market. So they had declining trends. So by the time the Commission implemented the remedy fully, and Microsoft followed that, the actual remedy had no practical effect. So I think the Commission tries to address this, and I think it does it in a very clever way. It has the compliance reports. It also has the works that it holds, so it can get information about from the actual market participants, whether the big gatekeepers are actually abiding by the obligations they have or not. And as Lluís said, the Commission has been very open and very pragmatic to also designate a service as not a core service of the DMA. So it has been very open to get services and companies outside the reach of DMA. It's not that Commission has come in here to try to get to start hitting on every single big tech company and big tech service they actually do. They have taken a very, in my view, mature approach to this, and they're trying to address the conducts they consider to be problematic. So they have published annual reports, and it's really interesting going through some of this, but I want to touch on just some of the more recent cases, and Lluís briefly mentioned a couple of them. So this is the Apple anti-steering rules, where if you want to, if you want to sign up to a service you have outside the App Store, Apple is supposed to allow you to do that as a consumer, but also as an app developer. Apple is supposed to allow the app developer to attract customers outside the app environment, the App Store environment, the iOS environment. So here we have an infringement by the Commission against Apple that has not actually, Apple has not abided by DMA in that respect, and there is a fine which was out in April 25. It's interesting how companies and Apple, Meta, all the companies I will mention in this presentation, they still seem to think that there is still room to evade the DMA obligation they have. And for some parts of DMA, Article 6, yes, there is room there. For Article 5, the room is very limited, and you can still see conduct which, even in the past, before DMA, have been anti-competitive. So, for example, the user choice obligation, which is the next one that Apple, and then the one after that, interoperability. These are type of conduct that even under 102, under any abuse of dominant legislation, probably globally, would be problematic. Now they're part of DMA, so it's an ex ante now obligation, and we still see companies trying to engage in these conducts. I'm sure they have justifications for why they're doing it, and probably they're testing the Commission's willingness to enforce DMA to its full strength, and probably testing Commission's understanding of the boundaries of DMA. And I don't blame them for that. I think if I were advising a company of this, which is addressed by the DMA in this type of conduct, I would probably advise the client, yes, you can test the waters, but I would also probably say it's very likely you will not succeed as the DMA is drafted. But we still see companies engaging in conducts which, reading the DMA, seems to be a no-go, but they're still doing it. So here, user choice obligations, Apple changed the conduct in this case. So the Commission closed the investigation. So again, it goes back to Lluís' point. The Commission has been willing to open and close investigations when the parties have abided. So here is one that the Commission closed the investigation. Here is the interoperability obligation, where Apple is supposed to allow interoperability. Gatekeepers are supposed to allow interoperability. Dominant companies are supposed to allow interoperability. This is 20 years case law now in Europe. So we still see these investigations happening. Now they happen faster under DMA when it comes to gatekeepers. So here we have Apple being investigated by the Commission, and finally Commission supporting the compliance efforts of Apple in relation to what they did to ensure interoperability. What I found very interesting is the pay or consent proposal of Meta, that you either have to give your data or you have to pay. And I personally, I don't use Facebook, but personally I applaud the Commission for going back and saying, no, it's not a pay or consent type arrangement here. You need to come up with a different arrangement to give a similar service without breaching DMA. And here was a fine as well of 200 million on Meta. And on online intermediation service, again, here Commission was open, saying we looked at the data and it doesn't now fall within the DMA. So Meta Marketplace is not a service at this point in time that Commission will be looking at when it comes to DMA. Again, to services out DMA, and a similar approach to X, that after investigation it decided X falls within the gatekeeper in part of the service, but not in all the services X currently has. And I'm going to finish with some thoughts on future enforcement, just because I think I'm running out of time. And the aim of the DMA was to a large extent be self-enforcing. I have not seen that so far, in the sense that we should expect when you have a law which says don't do something, and there are stakeholders who are able to assess the strength of that law, that regulation, we should expect soon enough, at least, to have fewer and fewer cases. Now, I understand and I agree that gatekeepers will need to, as I said, test the waters, test each other's understanding, gatekeepers versus commission understanding of how a particular rule applies, especially because it goes back to one of the first points I made, especially because the language is so technical that there can be some ambiguity just because it's a very technical language. So again, we will still see cases which will be attempts by both commission and gatekeepers to provide clarification to the paragraphs of mainly Articles 5 and 6 of DMA, in order to have more concrete now guidance for the future. There were 3 investigations opened within a month of implementation, and there are more in the pipeline. There are also 1 or 2 investigations, and Lluís also mentioned that. There are also 1 or 2 parallel investigations. I have an academic question here. How will the Commission differentiate between a conduct which is a DMA, it can be a DMA-related breach? It's also a 1 or 2 related breach. Will the EC at some point sit down and say which is the best tool to go against this conduct, and is the best tool DMA? So are we not going to see any more 1 or 2 interoperability, for example, cases when it comes to gatekeeper services? So I think I have a question in general in this respect. We'll see how the Commission is going to handle it. And we see a quick resolution to DMA cases, which is good. Comparing Google, Microsoft cases, Intel, I think closing a case within a year and a half, or reaching a decision within a year and a half is really what the DMA should be doing, and how it should be enforced. And my personal view again is that the clarity we will have from more Commission enforcement will probably, in the next few years, limit the number of cases we will see starting under DMA, because gatekeepers will have realized what the limits are likely to be, and they will probably be abiding by these limits. Thank you so much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Ioannis, for those reflections regarding the implementation of DMA. So now we move to Michael Lawrence. He's going to talk about how Google has been experiencing the implementation of DMA.
Thank you very much. My comments are my own and not necessarily my employer. First of all, thank you to IBRAC for inviting me. I thought I would take a perspective of someone who's in-house at a technology company and try to provide some perspective on this. So I recognize that increasingly jurisdictions around the world are looking at the Digital Markets Act and saying whether they should adopt some sort of digital platform regulation for their own country. And we've now had experience for a few years with the DMA. And I think it raises questions: what can we learn from it? Can we possibly improve upon it? And I think a lot of time is spent thinking about the substantive obligations. Should we have interoperability as a requirement? Under what conditions? What does non-discrimination look like? I'd like to talk about something related but different than that, which is, what is the mission or the objective of the regulation itself? What is it trying to achieve? Now, in traditional anti-monopoly cases, we would use something like the Consumer Welfare Standard, and it's been developed over decades. And it's helpful because it's largely objective. Have prices gone up? Has supply gone down? Is there a loss of innovation? And, it's a useful tool. No, certainly other standards are possible, but they might mean different things to different people. So take a concept like fairness. Fairness to whom? Are we talking about new entrants? What about the users? And so how flexible should these substantive obligations be? And it becomes important because, is there a role for pro-competitive efficiencies? And to give an example of the importance that this isn't just an academic question, I can give an example under the DMA. And I know, with all due respect to Lluís, there may be a difference of opinion here. So Google Hotels, for those who aren't familiar with it, if let's say you were in Europe in the past and you were to do a search, let's say for hotels in Kyoto, Japan, and you do the search, you would see a map. It would have dots all over it corresponding to hotels. And then below it, you would see a list of hotels. Now, in the past, you could click on the dot of a hotel that you saw on a map because maybe it's in a part of town that you wanted to go to, or you saw a hotel and you wanted to link to it. And when you would click on that link, you'd go directly to that hotel. Now, Google believed that in order to comply with the DMA, it was obliged to remove the links on the map so that now they're static images, you can't actually go directly to it, and also remove the ability to click through from the list of hotels below the map in order to go to those hotels. Now, coming from the Hotel Industry Association in Europe, they complained that they saw a 30% decline in direct traffic because those links would take users directly to the hotel. And I should point out that, what happened correspondingly is that there was an increase in traffic to online travel agencies. And from the hotel's perspective, they have to pay a commission to the online travel agency for that traffic that they would have gotten directly. And so it does raise transaction costs. And there are, questions about whether that was, from my perspective, that design change to comply was worth, the accessibility that it might otherwise give to online travel agencies because it might be viewed as self-preferencing. But again, to come back to the idea that I don't think the question of what is the mission, what are we trying to solve for, just an academic exercise. As a competition lawyer, I'm called upon to say, in this jurisdiction, will this product or this feature be lawful? And I want to get the answer right. I want to give good guidance to the business that if they launch, that they can have, comfort, I'll call it certainty, that they know where they're going to stand. And when I think about certainty, I sort of think of two things. One is predictability and consistency. And predictability is that they can reasonably anticipate looking at the words on the page and knowing the product, what the outcome might be. And then consistency being that it is clear from the mission that's stated for the platform regulation, what goal we're trying to achieve. How much of a role might there be for efficiencies to be considered, such that there's consistency that it shouldn't change from case handler to case handler, or over time, that one person looked at a product and said, I see no issue, and then a new person comes in and says something different. And so I think that the objective or the mission being clearly spelled out helps create that certainty. What's the consequence of this? Is that if you don't have certainty in the law, it could cause companies to make decisions that I don't have enough regulatory predictability that they may be hesitant to launch. And along those lines, and I applaud this from what I've heard before in reading, in speeches from the Ministry of Finance, is to encourage a dialogue that would be meaningful. I recognize that the gatekeeper company, whether it would be Google, has the burden of demonstrating that there would be pro-competitive justifications. But I think along the lines of when we're talking about what is the mission or the objective, is creating an understanding and a dialogue and also Lluís mentioned this too, I think it's very important to understand the product. These are complicated products. People might see something and they think it's very simple, but they can't begin to understand all the design decisions that have been made behind the scenes. And so to be able to have that kind of dialogue, I think, is really important. But to conclude, I do think it's important not just that we focus on the substantive obligations, but that we also consider what's the mission, because that will be the prism, presumably, through which the competition authority will look at how they should interpret and apply. And that really, to me, creates the roadmap for understanding, bringing the certainty for companies to make investments and launch innovations. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for those comments on the implementation of the business environment. So now we move on to Diogo, who's going to talk about Cade perspective, about how DMA enforcement in Europe has impacted discussion case analysis at Brazil.
Bom dia a todos. Vou pedir permissão ao Michael, ao professor Ioannis e ao professor Lluís para falar em português, dado que a gente está no Brasil, com uma plateia majoritariamente brasileira, então acho que eu, como servidor público, devo preservar o vernáculo. Também não vou fazer disclaimer, porque por mais que eu faça, vocês não vão acreditar que eu não estou falando pelo Cade, então é melhor eu falar sem disclaimer. Enfim, acho que o meu papel aqui, menos de falar dos casos recentes, já da implementação do DMA, porque quem me antecedeu sabe muito mais disso e está vivendo isso muito mais de perto, é falar um pouco como que o Cade, não só o Cade, mas talvez o governo brasileiro, dado que existe uma discussão sobre regulação digital em andamento, como a gente olha para o DMA e o que a gente procura aprender, tanto no sentido positivo como no sentido das dificuldades e dos obstáculos, para que a gente possa construir uma capacidade institucional para lidar com os mercados digitais. Acho que é claro que, e o Lluís colocou isso muito bem já no começo, existe uma série de razões pelas quais as transformações digitais mudam a forma do antitrust encarar determinados mercados, ela desafia certos paradigmas da defesa da concorrência e isso exige e tem exigido dos países uma discussão sobre se aquilo que já existe é suficiente, mais do que suficiente, se aquilo que já existe é tempestivo para que a gente consiga lidar com os problemas trazidos pela transformação digital. E acho que, nesse sentido, a gente tem aí uma série de legislações eclodindo aí pelo mundo. A gente, claro, tem o DMA como talvez o grande paradigma, mas também, como já mencionado, existe também uma mudança regulatória relevante no Reino Unido e também no Japão, uma lei que é muito interessante, até porque ela vai muito na linha do que a gente pretende, ou do que a gente vem discutindo, que é de trazer novos procedimentos e novas competências para a autoridade antitrust dentro da própria lei antitrust, né? Então, acho que isso é bastante interessante. Mas o DMA, ele é, de fato, esse grande paradigma, não só por ter sido, talvez, o primeiro, mas é porque ele tem prazos rígidos de implementação e ele tem obrigações rígidas a serem impostas àqueles que são designados e aos serviços de core platform. O que implica no fato em que eles já estão implementando e já estão vivendo nas práticas todos os problemas e todas as discussões e os debates que provavelmente vêm dessa complexidade que vai ser, ou que atuar de maneira ex ante, ou atuar de maneira proativa e tempestiva e suficiente para que a gente possa garantir a concorrência nos mercados digitais. Então, acho que talvez a primeira inspiração mesmo do DMA vem dessa arquitetura e dessa ideia de que somente mecanismos ex post talvez não sejam suficientes. Disso não decorre que a gente deve copiar o DMA. Inclusive, a gente teve uma experiência bastante, não vou dizer fracassada, porque eu acho que ela acabou mesmo, mas assim, ela foi bastante mal sucedida, de uma primeira tentativa que foi feita no Congresso Nacional, ainda há cerca de 2, 3 anos atrás, ainda antes desse governo, em que se tentava emular uma espécie de DMA, mas com uma série de problemas, né? Primeiro, porque não trazia objetivos claros, entregava muito poder discricionário ao regulador e colocava parâmetros de elegíveis à regulação muito baixos, o que fazia com um grande número de empresas fosse objeto dessa regulação. E até por essa primeira, talvez, experiência mal sucedida, é que veio a necessidade de se discutir isso mais a fundo e de, principalmente, olhar para o exemplo europeu, mas sem esquecer que isso precisa ser adaptado e, sobretudo, que isso tem que se encaixar num arcabouço institucional legal e até numa perspectiva do que é o mercado brasileiro e de como a transformação digital afeta o mercado brasileiro. Isso foi iniciado com a tomada de subsídios do Ministério da Fazenda, mas é uma discussão recorrente que o próprio Cade vem fazendo, até porque, exista ou não regulação futura, a gente mantém a nossa competência ex post de atuar nesses mercados e tem diversas investigações. Uma boa parte delas, inclusive, emulam preocupações e obrigações que são endereçadas na regulação ex-ante europeia, como, por exemplo, obrigações de portabilidade, de autopreferência, etc. Então, nós temos investigações em andamento que tratam exatamente daquilo que está sendo tratado do ponto de vista regulatório na Europa, e por isso a gente tem que fazer esse tipo de diálogo. O antitrust, historicamente, ele tem essa abertura, né? Naturalmente, desde a globalização da economia, as leis antitrust no mundo, elas induzem ao engajamento multilateral, então elas induzem a uma cooperação entre autoridades e elas induzem também a que as autoridades encontrem saídas que são comuns para que se possa criar remédios mais eficazes e que sejam aplicáveis. Quando a gente fala de ecossistema digital, isso é exacerbado, porque a gente está falando de empresas que atuam de maneira transnacional e de empresas que atuam com as mesmas estratégias no mundo inteiro, de maneira global. Então, elas definem suas estratégias também de maneira global, o que exige, obviamente, uma maior coordenação. Nesse sentido, criar legislações que conversem entre si talvez seja um grande passo, e é por isso que o DMA talvez tenha sido o pontapé inicial, mas que regulações desse tipo estão sendo pensadas no mundo inteiro. Mas, de novo, eu friso que a gente tem que ter um equilíbrio e buscar trazer para cá, para a nossa realidade, aquilo que é nosso, né? Então, por exemplo, aqui a gente tem alguns cenários, não só no Brasil, mas que se refletem na América Latina, que exigem um cuidado maior ao a gente falar sobre plataformas digitais. Por exemplo, a gente tem um mercado de fintechs extremamente, que cresceu extremamente nos últimos anos, mas que trouxe externalidades extremamente positivas ao lidar com o velho oligopólio tradicionais de bancos e abrir esse mercado, e inclusive abrir esse mercado para uma população que era desbancarizada. Então, ao lidar com isso, a gente não pode colocar na mesma prateleira aquilo que são as fintechs inovadoras que estão contestando um poder de mercado tradicional e aquilo que efetivamente se torna um poder de mercado de ecossistema digital. O mesmo vale para aplicativos de transporte, para aplicativos de delivery, que, sobretudo na América Latina, sempre tiveram muita importância. Outros elementos são trazidos, até mesmo quando a gente trata de casos que são análogos, como o caso de Big Techs. Então, por exemplo, toda uma discussão que existe com relação à Apple, por exemplo, fora do Brasil, aqui no Brasil ela é complexificada porque a gente tem uma coisa que talvez seja um patrimônio brasileiro recente que a gente tem descobrido que chama PIX e que pode, de fato, tem que ser levado em conta no meio de uma discussão, por exemplo, de um remédio possível. Então, acho que, como mensagem inicial, o que a gente tem feito é entender como a Europa tem lidado com as complexidades de implementar uma regulação deste tipo para conseguir criar no Brasil uma arquitetura que seja compatível com as nossas capacidades institucionais, mas também que seja mais direcionada àquilo que realmente é o problema no mercado brasileiro, né? Essa é a linha que a gente também buscou trabalhar no PL, mas disso eu vou falar mais para frente.
Obrigada, Diogo, pela exposição aqui. Agora a gente vai passar por uma sessão rápida de uma pergunta para cada, depois eu passo aqui para a plateia para fazer uma pergunta. Let's switch to Lluís. I'm going to talk about what role have economic analysis play in the enforcement and implementation of DMA so far. To what extent the economic concepts such as market constatability and assessment of market power guide the Commission practical decision, particularly given the ex-ante perspective nature of DMA?
Thank you, Fabiana, for the question. I will take the opportunity of also making some references to what has been said in the context of the answer to the question. I mean, maybe the first comment is, of course, there is economic analysis in the implementation, but sometimes I have the feeling that it's kind of assumed that there was no economic analysis in the making of the DMA, no? That these per se obligations come from. They actually come from economic analysis. And it's an economic analysis, and this is a bit of a reference to what I think very interesting point of Michael on the importance of the mission. And I think, and that's why I started as well on the importance of contestability and fairness for innovation, and innovation as a driver of long-term consumer welfare. And I think that's very important. And there are trade-offs in the decisions that we take. There are temporal trade-offs, and I think that we have to recognize. And economic analysis, both in the formulation of the obligations, helped to shape those obligations in a way that we think is coherent with an idea of welfare, even if it's not explicit in the DMA, and this is my economic reading. Probably lawyers would tell me, no, consumer welfare is nowhere in the DMA. And probably it's true, it's nowhere explicitly. But I would claim that because it's built on our experience on antitrust cases and our knowledge of economics from industrial organizations, that in the end relate to consumer welfare, what we see as obligations that seem disconnected from consumer welfare in the DMA actually are not disconnected from that. They come from our experience of applying legal tests and economic tests that are based and reflective of consumer welfare. So that would be one thing. So I think there is economics in the making of the DMA, and there is economics also in how we implement it. And I would make three references, three areas where I think it's important. One is the question of compliance or non-compliance. That's a tricky question, right? Because, I mean, and Ioannis referred to it. It's very detailed, it's very technical, it's very precise. There are other jurisdictions that are opting, they're choosing less concrete or less precise wording in their legislations. And I think the Japanese is a bit more, it refers more to concepts and principles, it's a little bit less prescriptive. But then we would be accused of lack of clarity. So there is a choice that the legislator has to make between clarity and being more prescriptive, or being more general and referring to principles, but that then will need to be clarified at some point during the implementation. And this goes back also to the question and the need of predictability. And probably there is no one right or wrong answer to it. I mean, there are, again, trade-offs that arise there, here from the juridic perspective. The fact that we are more precise means that we may be more at risk of circumvention, because gatekeepers could implement conducts that formally seem compliant with the DMA, but that in reality have the same effect, just in a formality of compliance. And that it's something that we should avoid. And there are some provisions on anti-circumvention. And there I think there is a role for economic analysis in terms of understanding when we are in front of a different conduct that is not exactly the conduct as it is described in the DMA, but that actually has the same effect. But of course, we don't want to enter into an effects analysis, because then we would go back to antitrust, okay? So, okay, there will be something that, while remaining in the assessment of a conduct, not in the assessment of its effects, we may need to say something, economists, we may need to say something about how we assess these situations of circumvention. Another example where I think economic analysis is needed is, and it's also included in an article in the DMA, that certain conducts are so linked to the very nature of the business, to the mechanics of monetization, that, of course, by not being able to do certain things, there may be a significant impact on the business model itself and on the ability of the business model to be viable. And that's something also that, of course, that's not where we want to go. It's not that the DMA should make non-viable business activities that actually produce efficient value for consumers and business users. So there, another trade-off. And I think there, financial analysis and economic analysis will help us understand when certain limitations on the conduct of companies may or may not compromise their financial viability, and how to be effective in respecting contestability and fairness, while at the same time not compromising this financial viability. And maybe the last point is on what will be the effects. How will we measure the success of the DMA? So in 3 or in 4 years' time, someone will come and will ask us, okay, was it a success or not? Did you achieve what you wanted or not? And the thing is that the DMA creates opportunities or seeks to create opportunities, but it does not mandate a market outcome. You can make markets contestable, but it's for market players and potential competitors to enter and transform the structure of that market. So we cannot assess the success of the DMA by achieving certain market outcomes. That's not the mission. But at the same time, we need some way of assessing whether we are being effective or not. And I think there will be a discussion, what are the metrics that we will need to look at to understand whether we are doing good or not? And maybe the last point, this is not about economics, but regarding what Diogo was saying, I think economists have a lot to contribute in terms of the coherence of these sets of regulatory tools across the world. Because institutions and legal traditions are different. And therefore, it makes sense that in Japan it's done in a certain way, that in Brazil it will take a different form. The administrative antitrust procedures in the European Commission are very different from the more court-based system in the US. Yet, in antitrust, we are able to ensure that our decisions on substance are coherent. And I think that's a little bit where we should go in terms of the regulation. I think it's not about the regulation being copy-paste from other jurisdictions, but it is about the content, the real decision that we are taking, making sense, making also economic sense for worldwide markets. And that's.
Thank you, Lluís. Economic analysis can always help to understand the context, so it's good to know. We're going to move to a question to Professor Ioannis. In academic debates, fairness appears to be less consolidated concept than contestability. Does the DMA provide concrete pathways to operationalize fairness, or it's an area demanding further theoretical and regulatory development?
Thank you, Fabiana. It's interesting, the word fairness appears about 90 times in DMA in different contexts. And when I think there was an article, there was an academic article, not just one academic article, when the Google search case was out, that they were debating how many times the word fair was used in Commissioner Vestager's at that time press release, when it issued the press release and did a speech on the case. So I think there's a lot of hype about the word fair. The way I see it being used in DMA is to substantiate or to explain why we're looking into contestable markets, why DMA is focusing on contestability, interoperability, because this is the fair thing to do. This is what will create fairness in markets. I think Michael made a good point in his intervention that if you are a hotel and the way the DMA has obliged Google to change its conduct may not be deemed fair by the hotel owners. So I think there is what is fair in each factual context, and who is the target that we're being fair or unfair will change. So I think there is a lot of fluidity in that. What is less fluid is the contestability aspect of this, because DMA aims to have contestable markets. So can you have a contestable market which is not fair? Yes, because it depends on whose fairness are you focusing on. If we take Michael's example, can you have a contestable market amongst travel agents? Yes, but this is not fair for hotel owners, but it is arguably fair for travel agents. So the word fair is used as an overarching justification for focusing on contestability in DMA, but I do not think that the same target group will the DMA will have the same fairness and contestable impact on the same target group in each case. And to answer your question, does there need to be more academic debate on this? Academics love debating about everything which is remotely interesting or not interesting. So yes, definitely, I don't see it will change practically the way DMA will be enforced, though.
Thank you, Professor. Now a question for Michael. What has been the approach of the second Trump administration regarding digital platform? Or what has been the impact on US companies in complying with DMA, and how is DMA felt within the United States?
Everyone has an opinion on the Trump administration. So I would say the Trump administration, in terms of the DMA, has been opposed to it. They believe that platform regulation is not the way to go, and that they prefer, as I see it, the traditional effects-based investigative approach based on the consumer welfare standard. I think people know that the Trump administration has even called the DMA attacks on American companies and wants to make it a point of negotiation over tariffs. Now, having said that, in the United States, I don't think that the approach of the Trump administration in terms of technology platforms is actually that much different than even the Biden administration. There are cases against Google, excuse me, against Apple, against Meta, against Amazon. And so all of these cases are going forward. And so I don't think the fact that they're opposed to the DMA necessarily means that they're in any way seeing or going light on technology companies. My take is that they've continued with the same level of vigor as the Biden administration, which was quite, I would say, aggressive or assertive against those companies. I don't see signs that, for example, early in the Biden administration, there was talk about different bills that would have sort of codified something like a platform regulation. Those didn't succeed in Congress. I'm not a legislative expert, but I'm not sure that anything is on the horizon that will come in that regard. One thing that is a unique feature of the Trump administration that's different than the Biden administration is the pursuit of technology companies, large platforms, over what they believe is bias against conservative speech, like COVID vaccines, like conservative voices, and that's come less out of the Department of Justice. We have two competition agencies in the US, the Department of Justice and the US Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has talked about the fact that they do have concerns about it. They've brought some investigations over companies that they felt may have conspired to exclude conservative voices. That's a unique feature of the Trump administration. I'm not sure we're seeing it in other places. In terms of the effects of the DMA on US companies, I without repeating myself, large companies, transnational companies do business in Europe, and so we're obviously subject to it. And so, I won't repeat myself, but I think the things I said before apply in this era, that it's difficult to be a large international company doing business. And of course, there's the Brussels effect. You're an unavoidable market, an attractive market, but we obviously have to comply with the rules, meaning the DMA.
Thank you, Michael, for that. Diogo, a última pergunta aqui antes de a gente passar para a plateia. O Brasil está avançando aí na sua própria regulação de plataformas digitais. Como é que o Cade ele tem se preparado para endereçar essas novas responsabilidades e desafios inspirados pelo DMA?
Bom, de fato, a gente tem, de maneira bem avançada dentro do Poder Executivo, já uma proposta de um futuro projeto de lei. E a ideia desse projeto de lei, esse projeto se decorre daquela tomada de subsídios do Ministério da Fazenda que eu mencionei, e esse projeto de lei entregaria novos procedimentos e novas competências ao Cade, para que se possa atuar de maneira ex ante em determinadas situações, envolvendo, sobretudo, alguns agentes de poder de mercado significativo e também com relação a alguns tipos de serviços e alguns tipos de plataformas que sejam mais problemáticos. A ideia desse período todo, principalmente por parte do Cade, o Cade não participou só de maneira formal, fornecendo subsídios para tomar de subsídios, mas são inúmeras reuniões, eu perdi a conta de quando eu, a conselheira Camila, os nossos chefes de gabinete, o Paulo e o Vitor, tiveram com órgãos de governo, tentando, sobretudo, demonstrar o que a gente buscava e o que a gente entende como mais adequado às nossas capacidades institucionais, até porque a gente sabe que isso lidar com isso no futuro vai ser complexo e vai também envolver muitos recursos humanos e materiais que são escassos, foi de buscar fazer com que esses procedimentos respeitassem uma tradição institucional do Cade, que é uma tradição ao diálogo, às soluções negociadas, e que, ao mesmo tempo, a gente conseguisse preservar que o enforcement ex post vai continuar existindo de maneira tão ou mais eficaz também para os mercados digitais. Então, a ideia é realmente de buscar um equilíbrio entre o ex ante e o ex post. Uma coisa não funciona sem a outra, e se nunca vier o ex post, a gente vai ter que usar o ex post. Então, todo o nosso esforço ali tem a ver com buscar criar instrumentos que sejam mais eficazes, e até seguindo uma linha que é a linha do G7, da OCDE, inclusive, de tentar fazer com que esses instrumentos ex post e ex ante conversem entre si, respeitando, como eu disse, essa tradição do Cade de buscar soluções negociadas e o diálogo regulatório. Um outro ponto em que a gente vem reforçando, e já vem reforçando nos casos concretos, mas que a gente pretende também utilizar, é algo que já existe no DMA, mas que no Brasil talvez precise de uma melhor... eu diria uma melhor disseminação, que é a participação da sociedade civil nesses casos, sobretudo quando a gente falar de regulação ex ante, né? Não dá para... A transformação digital ela é pervasiva o suficiente para que a gente não escute apenas os agentes econômicos envolvidos quando está desenhando um remédio que vai afetar gente que não necessariamente é agente econômico ou que não é o agente econômico necessariamente regulado. Então, essa abertura para a sociedade civil, essa abertura para a participação de outros players interessados, ela é necessária tanto no ex post quanto no ex ante.
Obrigada, Diogo. Temos um tempinho aqui para perguntas. Quem gostaria? Adriana. Acho que microfone, por favor.
So this is good morning. A question for Lawrence, of course. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about what regulators, regarding all these new pieces of laws that are being discussed in Brazil, what do you think regulators should focus on with respect to platform behavior in the next 5 years, thinking about regulation of digital platforms? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think that we can take the experience, in my opinion, from the DMA and think about how we might learn from that experience, and can there be things done to improve it? From my perspective, at least from what I saw from the Ministry of Finance of their, I think it was 12 points, one of them was this idea that, if a company is designated a gatekeeper, it will have the burden, but it can present pro-competitive efficiencies as a defense or an explanation. And that, I think that's an important thing. I think it's helpful. I realize that with platform regulation being ex ante, you're not trying to have a detailed ex post, rule of reason balancing, but I think it's a positive step to welcome that kind of dialogue. I also think it's important, though, that there be meaningful dialogue. If it's an exercise where it doesn't really lead to a discussion or questions, it may look good on paper, but it's more theoretical. So I would say a meaningful opportunity short of what I'll call, anything close to an ex post investigation, but a meaningful opportunity, I think, is a good way to create, I'll call it a safety valve on what otherwise could be perceived as overly rigid substantive obligations.
Mais alguma pergunta? Não? Então, acho que encerramos aqui. Agradecer a presença de nossos painelistas. Voltaremos depois do almoço. O almoço vai ser aqui no andar de baixo. Que horas, Ricardo, que a gente volta? À 1h35 estaremos de volta aqui para o terceiro painel. Obrigada a todos e todas.